move to this story. The UN Security Council is meeting later to discuss the situation in Syria and who's going to be ruling the country. Former President Assad's regime was overthrown by Islamist rebels earlier yesterday morning, ending a 13-year civil war that has killed more than 500,000 people. Russia says he's been granted political asylum there. Let's speak with Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun. Afternoon to you, Jerome. I guess, firstly, no prizes for guessing that Russia is where this man might have ended up.
Yeah, that's right, Ian. I mean, these reports first emerged from Russian state media. There was speculation that Bashar al-Assad had left Damascus on a flight, but wasn't sure where. Reports that he'd landed somewhere perhaps in the Middle East. But now, as you say, Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesman, has confirmed that not only is Bashar al-Assad in Russia, but that he's there with the express blessing of President Putin. So, the Russian tyrant is welcoming the ousted, the deposed tyrant, his fellow tyrant, from Syria after propping up that regime for so many years. We've all seen it sort of collapse spectacularly in just a few days.
Yeah, and I'm guessing Assad has not been put up in a St. Petersburg block of flats somewhere. I'm sure there's a fairly nice arrangement that's been met for him.
Do you know what? That's a really good question, the sort of life he might hope to lead now, because I guess this will be a man who's been looking over his shoulder in his own country for so long, because he's been hated so much. And it's worth remembering the sort of country, the sort of regime he led. Hard really to understate the level of atrocities that Bashar al-Assad's regime perpetrated against its own people. And there is no shortage. He has no shortage of enemies from his own Syrian countrymen. And, we do not know yet what kind of conditions or living arrangements he will have in Russia. Russia may be keen to try and show that it looks after its deposed proxies well, but ultimately, Russia has already lost that prestige battle. Its man in Damascus has been ousted. So whether or not they can put him up in some level of grandeur and splendor now for the rest of his days is really irrelevant. They failed to keep him in place. And I have to say, given what we've seen of attacks against other Russian officials inside Russian territory, these are the sort of sabotage attacks against people perpetrating the war in Ukraine, I think it's a fair bet to say that Bashar al-Assad will be fearing for his safety.
Yeah, I'm sure that is true. And of course, the Assad's, half a century of running Syria. It's not been a pretty picture. But of course, it may still not be a pretty picture, Jerome, and that's the problem here, isn't it? This is not an overthrowing that happened because, I don't know, somebody at the University of Damascus, a student, had an idea and started a petition. I mean, this is, another terror group that is now looking to control the place. Sure, the Americans are in there keeping their eye on what is going on, but this is not a straightforward turning of a page from bad to good.
No, it's a moment of extraordinary jeopardy. There are scenes of jubilation, and that jubilation is about the collapse of the Assad regime because of the misery and the pain that the Assad regime inflicted on its own people. And we've seen that through the course of the civil war, and we've seen that misery particularly in places like Sednaya prison, which is where aid workers in the white helmets and others are racing to these sites now to try and make sure that people aren't dying in hidden cells. But these were the torture chambers, the institutions of mass death and torture perpetrated by the Assad regime against anyone they suspected of disloyalty. It was where people disappeared, it was where people were tortured, it was where people were, hanged in secret underground chambers. And those horrors have been remarkably well documented by rights groups over the years. But you're right, it's not necessarily as simple as, the bad being ousted and replaced with the good. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization which has sort of spearheaded this lightning advance to Damascus, was for many years sort of an affiliate, a branch of al-Qaeda, very much aligned with their extremist and sort of terror-supporting views. But it is worth pointing out that Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the leader of HTS, has spent many years trying to change the way his group is perceived, and that he's effectively been trying to present himself as a respectable government in waiting, and he appears to have had the support, key support from Turkey. Now, Turkey plays a very complicated game in a very complicated arena. But this reminds me in some senses of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And there's been a pause. I think the world will take stock and wait to see what happens and how HTS, how its fighters behave. But so far, and it's really early days, but so far we have seen those indications that they are trying to behave not like a terror group, but more like a government that can have, respectable, sort of responsible dealings with its neighbours. And we've seen orders not to storm state property, orders that, certain people and certain groups are being deliberately respected. And that all seems stage managed at the moment to try and present themselves, as I say, as a government that people can do business with.
And I think I'm right in saying, Jerome, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the Prime Minister is still in situ in Syria. Is that right?
At the last I heard, absolutely, and presenting himself as a kind of interlocutor, perhaps, between the old and the new. I mean, to go back to your previous point about the fears of what HTS may represent, Israel just this afternoon has confirmed that it's carried out airstrikes against suspected chemical weapons locations in Syria to prevent those weapons falling into the wrong hands. And clearly be a huge concern to Israel, the wider region and the world were Islamist terror organizations to get their hands on Syria's a sort of state-backed arsenal of chemical weapons. And we think Israel may also have hit a place which it said was used to develop rocket technology. Again, in the chaos of the last few days as HTS have advanced, Israel's taken that opportunity. They've just confirmed this afternoon to take out what they believe was some of the Assad regime's military capabilities for those reasons, for those concerns which you so rightly brought up.
Now, of course, we remember, a decade or more ago now, people fled Syria in large numbers. Germany, famously, of course, that great Angela Merkel moment of opening the doors for people fleeing. I think there were, was it 5,000 or something? People came to this country. Lots of different areas stepped up to the plate after there was a huge exodus. Are we likely to see something like that again?
Well, actually, what we're seeing at the moment is the reverse. So, on the Turkey-Syrian border, there were huge queues late last night as people flocked to try and go back to their homes. Germany has said today that it's going to be reviewing its asylum policy now as a result of the sort of change in the situation in Syria. Now, again, really too early to tell with any certainty how this is going to bed down, how it's going to play out. Worth remembering, though, that the Assad regime, the Assads came from the Alawite minority, a sort of a sect within Syria, and it was their Alawite group which largely benefited from the Assad regime at the expense of many, many others. Now, one would expect perhaps for some vengeance to be taken by the new powers in the land against the perpetrators of the crimes of the last regime. But as yet, we haven't seen that. And so therefore, you'd expect perhaps the people who rode high on the hog of the Assad regime to be thinking about their futures now, and they may be the ones who are trying to flee, or if they were clever enough and read the way this was going, they may have already fled. But in terms of large numbers, in terms of, sort of the tides of humanity that we've seen being pushed around Europe by these refugee crises, this may actually spell an opportunity for many refugees. I mean, this may be too optimistic yet, but we have seen people trying to return in the last day or two, and that appears to be in jubilation because the Assad regime has been toppled.
That's interesting. Jerome, very thorough stuff. Thank you. Really appreciate that. That's Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun.